G'day, welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I've got a bit of a project that I want to unveil as to what I'm up to and a bit of concept behind it, and I suppose it's the concept has turned into something else, a decent video I think I can build for everyone, or a decent video series I can build for everyone to be able to learn a little bit about what I do and how I'm doing it. So there's a few things I'm talking about. One is, to start off with, I introduced a little while ago, was that I'd got this little Ruger Precision Rimfire 22 Magnum, and I was going to do some testing with it. And it was attached to the concept of ELR Precision, or Rimfire. Yeah, so Rimfire ELR. We've obviously pushed the 22 long rifle, got a little PRS and ELR course that we do, shoot it out to 500 yards on 6-inch steel with a little rimfire bullet. So that's the 22, just the normal 22 long rifle. And it is a great thing to do. It's got, it's really fun using in the fashion of just a factory loaded round. So that's really the main limitations. You can really do it as cheaply or as expensively as you might like to do that. And like I said, your limitations, very limited in the distance it can actually ultimately go to, and the accuracy you're going to see because of the ammunition. And yes, there is people who are looking at bringing to the market a little rimfire, a little bullet that is a little monolithic bullet, so a lot more accurate bullet, and try and do that. And that's a different path. That's not the one we're heading on. But in that same concept, I thought of doing the 22 Magnum, a little bit more power in the Magnum, and then that gives you a little bit more flexibility, was my concept. But I actually had a different thing going on there. And I should say with the 22 Magnum, I've never had one that shot super accurately. I'm not saying they don't, I'm not saying that some don't, but the concept of trying to make a little rimfire shoot very accurately, and I had another thing in my head, which I suppose is what I'm about to let you know, and that is this. This little bullet here was what was in my head. And what is this little bullet here? It's a strange little bullet. Great looking little bullet, I think. But what it actually is a little bit of a hand-loaded bullet. So in my head, and this might end up being ultimately fantasy, and I'll go through this process step by step. In my head, my thoughts are, when you have only a limited amount of range and a limited amount of dollars, and you still want to play the ELR game, then shooting a 22 is great. And you can certainly do it. It certainly teaches you a lot. It's really good. But the next level up would be a little bit more power, a little bit more consistent at the 300 yard or 500 yards, or maybe even going past that point, but getting down to where you can get some accuracy. And I see no logical reason why you shouldn't be able to get the same sort of accuracy out of a rimfire if we can line up some other dots. And then I suppose there's also into part of that being actually starting down a hand loading process. Only the very bare basics of it, but starting down a hand loading process. And I thought I could do, and have done, is exactly that. This is actually a 50 grain federal ammo with a 50 grain round that I have extracted the bullet and then taken out the powder of, I think, what I did the first time round, I did 10 rounds the first time round, took the powder out, measured the powder individually and then together, took an average of the powder, and actually what I did for the first time round was I put a tiny bit more in. So I pulled down 11 bullets, shook out all the powder, measured it all up, put 1.1 more grain on the average, or on the biggest one I found, I put 1.1 grain more, and then reloaded the cases with exactly that 0.1 grain more. I say exactly, but it's only to 0.1 grain, and I feel that maybe I need to go finer than that for these little bullets. But basically filled all the cases back up with exactly the same amount of powder to the 0.1 grain, and then pushed bullets in. And what these are, I actually did two different sizes. One was, this is a 52 grain, so the powder load that I had in there meant that it was it still worked, it still fitted properly, but pushed the bullet a fair bit further out, which turns it into a single loading bullet. Still doable, still able to put in here as a single load, but turning it into a single loading bullet. These are the 40 grain, and these are burger projectiles. They're 22 caliber burger projectiles. And I put these in, which are 40 grain. I put a little bit more powder again when I did it, because I pulled the 50 grain bullet out, put these in, did it like that. These are still a little too far to run in the magazine, so still single loading, but the 40 grain potentially I can go through and make that work. So, and make it actually a magazine loading bullet as well. So that was what was in my head. Could I do that? Get to that place and do that? I went straight to that process. I basically shot this gun as you saw it previously. Now, the only thing it had on it was a bag rider. It didn't have this extra little extension on here. It didn't have a muzzle brake on it. I just shot it like that. And I actually went out and tried shooting it straight up at 500 yards and found that I wasn't seeing much consistency. I'd already shot it with these ones here, the 50 grain Federals at 600 yards, and it wasn't on the target all the time, but it still got on steel reasonably consistently at 600 yards. So I thought, okay, we want to get better than that. I came back to 500 yards and tried the 50 grain projectile there, the 52 grain projectile, and no, it wasn't even close. So I thought, okay, I've gone 2 steps or 10 steps too far. I'll come back to doing 100 yard stuff and do some testing with it. Now, with that in mind, I did do some testing and found that the chassis was, this little rimfire chassis is a little bit too flexible. Quite good for playing and plinking and that sort of stuff, but when it came into precision stuff, it was a little bit more flexible than I wanted to. I had just the bag rider and it was just actually squishing around the back here. So very hard to get any preload or actually make it shoot other than just shooting it off the shoulder type thing or just sitting on the bipod, and even then just not quite as rigid as I like in a chassis. So I put in a little spacer here to start off with, and then the other concept I had in my head was being a fairly rigid little, it's a 20-inch barrel, but the front of a fairly light receiver or action and bits and pieces. I felt that just maybe, and I've heard this story before, I haven't run into so much myself because I haven't used rifles like that, but actually in the smaller calibers with a fairly short stiff barrel is you can run into some pretty erratic groups. What that is, that doesn't always happen. Generally it's fixed with running a suppressor on it or changing something like a muzzle brake where it actually, and I haven't done the proper testing, but suspecting that what actually happens is that there's a fairly heavy resonance that comes down here from the vibrations of the shot, and that's actually causing some erraticness. Didn't know if that was the case. My simple thought to test it was to put a little muzzle brake on the front of it. And I should say the muzzle brake, I could barely feel a difference anyway. It's not trying to do recoil at all. It's actually trying to have something on the end to actually absorb some of the resonance and try and make it shoot better. That was what that was there, and that's one of the things I was testing. So that's how I went out and shot it with muzzle brake testing and a little bit stiffer in the back of the chassis. Now, you see there's some more modifications. I'll get into that in a little bit. I went through and tested muzzle brake on, muzzle brake off. And as you can see here, okay, so we'll go to
nice. That's 10.
Okay. Okay.
Radio?
Well, not awesome, is it? Let's take the muzzle brake off. It looked a little bit better. There was a couple of pretty big flyers in that muzzle brake off thing, but there was a tighter group overall. But the way I test things is, even though there were 10 shots in each group, that's not a test for me. That there's other things going on. There's a little bit more flexibility in the back of the chassis than I wanted still, and it's a little bit difficult getting comfortable with the thing. I really wasn't feel like it was hitting any grooves or making any sense. So I did the same thing again, just using 9 shots from that point forward. I built these little magazines you can get, which is actually they're normally half this. I've stuck them together so I can load up 2 and just swap them over. So it actually turns from a 9-round magazine to an 18-round magazine. And I can run 2 different loads of ammo on there. But basically loaded up this and then did another muzzle brake on couple of tests. Let me go back to muzzle brake on. So I'm just going up from there with this one.
Okay.
Okay, and that's what you see that shooting like there. Go through that shot, started to get a little bit more consistent, same sort of group, but really ended up where getting a little bit more comfortable with the rifle, it's starting to group. Still pretty terrible for what I'm used to. I don't expect to shoot over half MOA with any of my centerfires, so still terrible, but starting to get a little better. Then in testing properly, pulled the muzzle brake off again and went through and did these 2 groups. The muzzle brake actually ends up being a little bit better, doesn't it? And you see there's a little bit of the fly thing, but settling down just a little bit bigger. What it turned into, to me, probably really nothing in it, but it seemed a tiny bit better with the muzzle brake on. So, looks better with the muzzle brake on too. Anyway, that was where I decided, okay, I'll go with that. And yes, you could test everything backwards and forwards and that sort of stuff, but this is a fairly crude test to go through and do to do this sort of testing. The next thing I wanted to do, because I know I was going to be asked, but actually do the test with some of the higher speed ammo and see if that was better. See if the fairly low, I think this is 1530 feet per second. I haven't chronographed it and probably will have to, but 1530 feet per second was what the 50 grain stuff was running. And then there's these 30 grains and 30 grains at 33 grains and 40 grains ranging between 2200 feet per second and 1900 feet per second. Did these groups here. I'll do a different hole point. I'll go for the center of that.
There we go.
Okay, that's what that group looked like.
Yep.
Cool.
Good to go. That should be it, mate.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Went through and tested that. As you can see, listen, there's a little bit better, a little bit worse, but all pretty terrible actually for trying to call it a precision rifle. But still tested and we could see it was actually happening. Then, once we've done that, then single feeding the 40 grains. You can see that group with the single feeding of the 40 grains. It was fairly interesting. It's a lot of vertical spread, one place, another place, but the horizontal was very, very, very straight. I think there's something else going there. Maybe that's speed, maybe that's how that barrel's moving at that thing. Don't know, I have to do some more measuring, but that was an interesting group. The next one, which is the 52 grains, well, they did exactly like they should do. Way over to the they really were pushing the boundaries. It's a 1 in 14 twist barrel. I think, and I've forgotten whether these are 1 in 14. I think that 1 in 14 is the minimum twist. It might be 1 in 13 is the minimum twist. But of course, it's really bullets for centre fire. these are running so much slower in here that the RPM's a lot lower, so they weren't even likely to be stable. But and I suppose one of the things I'll tell people quickly in that little bracket is stability factors. People like to focus on them a lot. Stability factor is a portion of bullet stability. It sounds like everything, but it's actually length versus RPM. There's center of pressure, there's the shape of bullet, there's other things in the ballistic coefficient designs that change the balance side of things, which actually are a factor that affect the stability factor. So I always test. To a reason, I knew I was pushing the boundaries here, but I always test regardless of the numbers. I really don't focus on the numbers more so than I focus on how it actually shot. But proof of this stability factor is it was terrible, and the group was terrible. You can see why it was bad at 600 yards. It was really bad and you can see they're actually going through the target sideways if you have a look at that. It's not completely sideways, but it certainly was yawing all over the place, wobbling all over the place. So yeah, they weren't going to work. Looked beautiful, looked like a really smart little bullet, but just too much bullet. Need a lot more twist in a barrel to do that. And my focus is to make it work with a standard barrel. So that's how our group shooting went, which is all pretty terrible, but we got some pretty good info there. Certainly the next test I carry on with, and I should say, what I did next was put the muzzle brake back on. Which way up is this target? There we go, yep. Put the muzzle brake back on and shot that group and that group with the 50 grains in there just to verify everything and see where it was. And you can see it shot pretty much like it ended up shooting. Groups are pretty damn similar as to how it actually shot. So it just verified things where they were, and that's what they ended up with. There's that target we were looking at with all the groups on here. Like I said, with these 40 grain ones, very interesting little pattern. 2 up here together, 1 down there, but really very, very limited in its horizontal spread with a definite something going on there. Maybe that's the muzzle, don't know, but the other side of things is quite noticeable is the size of the actual imprint of the bullet going through there. Nice and straight, very stable in its path, and a nice, very fine little spitzer going through here with little of this sort of impacting of these other little fellas. So anyway, interesting. So what did I found for that, and what are my conclusions to go with it? My conclusions are the muzzle brake really doesn't do anything, but I really am suspicious about the barrel in this thing. Not in the way of a problem with the barrel, but I think there might be some movement at the tip, which is going on. And listen, I haven't used a 22 Magnum very much. The bits I have and what I've seen of them, those sort of groups, really coming down to just over 1 MOA, sort of. What are the good groups? Yeah, we're probably talking 1.5 MOA is what we're talking at 100 yards. It's probably pretty consistent for a 22 Magnum. I think there's a lot I can do with it. There's a lot I can do. And really, I suppose the other thing I was talking about, what I can show people, is I quite commonly have spoken in the past about how I don't do a lot in the way of load development to make a rifle shoot. I make sure the load works properly, I make sure my pressures are good, I do all those sort of things, and make sure physically the loading feels good, and then I focus on a group by making the rifle shoot. Sometimes you can do that by when you're dealing with a bit of a problem child like this, by getting a feel and working out exactly what it wants. When you're pulling it back into, you're pushing it down or whatever it is, there's a place where this rifle starts to work. I really didn't find that yet. That's not the feeling, because I just don't really like the chassis on it, to be truthful. And that really comes down to this piece here being so small, being plastic, means that actually, as I tried to load anywhere, I can't do it now because I've modified it, but there was a lot of flexibility in it once you started to try and put any preload in it, to try and get it stable, to try and make it shoot really well to precision shoot. So that combined with the barrel, in the way of I think there's a bit of harmonics coming through the barrel, and I think it might be a little bit inherent with the 22 Magnum. Don't know. It is, I think, a problem with this, and I'm going to go through and test it and make it shoot. Not a real fan of the blade trigger. I think I can adapt and deal with that. I tend to operate very gently, and you really got to get right in and get right into that blade. And maybe I'll change that, but that's really just a me thing. I can deal with that. That's something that I can make work. And I suppose what I'm talking about is you can already see I've started to work on it. This bit of steel I put in here is actually to see I can push quite hard down here. There's almost no flex in the back of this thing. So it means that everywhere I now can preload and push with cheek pressure or anything like that is all controlled by what I've actually done is it's a quick release clamp. It's got one of my multi-fit bag riders on it. And then there's a hunk of steel I got in here. It has another little brace point in here, which just turns it into a bit more of a truss section. And then there's a solid bar that goes up into the pistol grip with a bolt on here. That means that turns into a truss section and then attaches to the action through this section here, not just this section here. Gives it a lot more rigidity, a lot more strength. So I'm very happy with that. A little bit more weight in it, which isn't a terrible thing either for precision shooting. And I should qualify, this is all amplified by the fact that I'm 6'4" and I have a fairly long length of pull, so I'm actually asking it to do a fair bit more. So this helps with it because of the extra length of pull I'm using, but really also to get around this very small part here, which I would ideally have liked if they'd made that thicker. Anyway, that works well there, puts in a nice push into the back of it. At the front here, muzzle brake, as I said, did next to nothing, but I think that's still a place to focus on. And I've got some stuff I'm going to try on the front of this. And I suppose what I'm talking about for people in the centerfire world and precision shooters, it's a case of barrels or your stability factor, or you've got to get your load pressures right, or all the things that the normal centerfire precision shooter would say. But if you go to a rimfire precision shooter, they have things called barrel tuners. Now they have basically, it's a bolt-on extension which doesn't affect the bullet in the way of its flight or in the way of the air around the bullet. It's not like a muzzle brake, it's not like a flash hider, it's not doing anything out the front there. It's really about attaching a piece of metal that takes that sonic or that the vibration, the harmonics of the charge or the bang that's going up and down the barrel and causing the barrel to wriggle at the ends. And it takes that, and by putting the right length on there, they're tunable so you can take them backwards and forwards and find out exactly where it is. But what they're actually doing is taking that vibration to where it's not moving the barrel as much when it goes bang. So the same as your nodes and the same as all the things talk about with load data and that sort of stuff. That's what they're doing with their tuners. I have some different concepts that I'm going to try with this thing and try and test. And listen, if they're complete failures, you might not get to see them. You might get to see them, but hopefully there's a success there. And the ultimate goal is to end up with whichever ammo. And I'm not, I'd love to see one of these little hand load things work, because I really like the concept for being able to make it shoot properly. But I really like the concept for it sort of just the beginning of hand loading. It lets you do a little bit of it without needing too much stuff. It's in a rimfire form. It's not too expensive. Yes, you're always going to be pulling apart bullets and using the powder out of the bullets. It's different powder, and there's things like that. So you'll be finding a bullet that you like to use and that sort of stuff. If this works. So you'll find a round that you like to use and pull them apart and do all this sort of stuff. It's very, very baby hand loading. But a nice sort of thing for people who want to progress down that road is sort of in my head. With a cheap rifle, without needing to do too much, and there's no doubt a lot more precision rifles to get, a lot better ways to do things, but this lets me do both things. It lets me show exactly what I talk. When I say I make a rifle shoot, well, this is the beginning of the processes. And sometimes I go down the wrong path and I've got to come back and go down a different path. And sometimes I learn from bits and pieces, like I just did, like I'm just showing you. The muzzle brake side of things really didn't affect very much. Maybe I put a heavier one on here and that would absorb more vibrations and that would actually help. But to actually see it actually work, where I can actually show it in this form, I think it's a good opportunity to show people. Last thing I'd say is, as you can see there was a bit of mirage to go on that, which wasn't so noticeable to us, or wasn't noticeable to us at all when we're actually shooting it. But when you look at that close range footage on from the 100 yards on the long range camera, you can see the targets moving around a little bit. When I looked at that, I thought, oh, wait a minute, it was maybe mirage a little bit about what the groups are doing. Listen, I really don't think so. The movement was more than that in the groups. And the other thing I can say is the moment I put this one away, I pulled out a customer's rifle, which is, I don't do a lot of that sort of stuff, but I was just putting together, just zeroing it, putting it on paper, and it ended up shooting with just a hunting scope on a little 243 Hauer.
To go, mate.
It ended up shooting, we got a, just under half MOA group for the last 4 shots out of that. That's how that was shooting after I'd run it in. Only put 20 shots through it, and it ended up shooting like everything that I would expect. That says, no, it wasn't Mirage. It was to do with the rifle. And listen a fair bit about, I'd be completely honest and say I wasn't getting super comfortable in this thing. I wasn't able to find a place. It was just a little bit too squishy and I wasn't finding a place. But truthfully, I think those are pretty honest groups. Would be a terrible, terrible day if I was out there with a centerfire and shooting like that. That'd be a horrible day and I'd be tearing something apart and putting it back together in a hurry. But for this is really what it performed like. Like I said, hopefully these little things are going to work and I can turn it into where, and I suppose realistically, I would be really disappointed if this ends up with a 1 MOA gun. I'm trying to get it to a half MOA gun sort of numbers. I really want to get to where it can print a little bit. And I don't see why I shouldn't be able to, but I don't know what it's going to take to get there. And I can't say it is going to get there. That's just what my feelings are. Anyway, that's it. Let us know any thoughts on that sort of stuff. I suppose last bits I'd say to go with it is the gun. It's obviously the Ruger Precision Rimfire in 22 Magnum. Little bits of mods down the back here. Everything else is stock. It's got this little Citron scope on it. So that's the 6 to 24. 6 to 24. 50mm Citron tactical scope, one we've had for a long time, been on Sam's rifle for a long time. Great little scope, except for the parallax nod gets so tight on them, but great scope, awesome. I've put it on, put a little rail on the bottom here and put it on the it's not their PRS, I've forgotten the brand, which one it is, but there's the Atlas bipod on the front here, so we're trying to do things very thoroughly with it, and we'll see what we end up with, but let's hope I can end up with a really straight shooter. Anyway guys, thanks for checking in on us. We'll catch you next time.